on the agenda is a review of the 2021 budget and status discussion relating to the implications around contingency plans. I think Linda and Joanne were going to do that. Linda, why don't I turn it over to you, and then you can coordinate with Joanne. This is really the bulk of the agenda. We'll try to go through here smartly. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Joanne.
And Linda, you could just take it over. You can, however you want to do it, but feel free to share what you got.
Sure. I'll share my screen. There is a lot on this agenda, so I think we'll just kind of hit them as they're organized. I did send the packets on Saturday. Chuck requested that I did. The packets are not necessarily in the order of the agenda, so I'm going to read the page numbers so you could follow, but I'm also going to share my screen. So let's see. Tom, can you enable screen sharing? It's saying it's disabled.
You should be able to. Let me make you a co-host.
He should be the co-host. He could be the host.
Tom, you should be a pro by now.
Do you guys see this?
You guys got this down.
Okay, so I'm going to start, and I'm first going to scroll to page 73, which was the last set of the documents that I sent you last week. And so kind of share where we are year to date. If I can make this bigger. Move that there. Okay. So what I did here was I looked at the summary of the general fund, the expenditures, and then the revenues. So I walked through the expenditures, where we were with the budget year to date. I ran the year to date numbers as of yesterday, and then where we're projecting to be for the end of the year. And then I do the same thing with the revenues, and it ties with where we will be as far as fund balance. I do have a plug number for the Board of Ed from some earlier projections, but Joanne will help me here with where she sees the Board of Ed ending, because there's some additional COVID expenses that we'll talk further down. So if I start from the very first, looking at FY 19-20, the revised budget.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody muted him.
Ooh.
Linda, I think you're muted.
Okay, here. I may have unmuted myself, actually. So the year-to-date budget that was approved on the expenditure side was $151.9 million. This budget is a revised budget. The adopted budget was $1 million less. This includes an adjustment for an additional $1 million to fund the internal service fund on the town. When we took on the library, we assumed their healthcare expenses, but for 2 years we had not included. We were basically funding their insurance premiums from the town contributions, and so this year we're making that adjustments for the 2 years that we've done that, and that's why you see that that increase. So the total budget is 151.9. Year to date, where we are at 127, which is consistent with where we would be this time of year. The only thing that I would like to highlight here that stands out is this 185. 127 is at the very bottom. It's the last number at the bottom.
Yeah, okay.
So year to date, we're at $127.3 million in total expenditures. Most of the expenditures are consistent with where we would be this year, with the exception, you'll see that we now have this town COVID expenses of 185. These are actual expenses that the town has incurred across various departments. These funds will get reimbursed. Those that are reimbursable, a majority of these will get reimbursed through either FEMA which is at 75% reimbursement, but the state also has received grants through the CARES Act, which will cover most of the expenses that are not reimbursed by FEMA, the balance of the 25%. So by the time all is said and done, we should be receiving reimbursement for a majority of these COVID-related expenses.
Linda,
However, we don't.
Linda, there's also another amount sitting in the Board of Education, is that right? COVID expenses?
Yes,
Correct.
these are the
Yes.
town COVID expenses, and
Yeah,
Joanne
and is that subject to reimbursement too, or is that still kind of a question that the board, the schools?
Yeah, a significant portion will be reimbursed through FEMA, and then we're expecting another grant through the CARES Act that's yet to come, but we're expecting about $90,000. So there's some education-related expenses we've incurred that would go against the CARES Act, and then there's the bulk of the expenditures will go against FEMA, and the highest portion of, we spent over 200,000, just over 200,000 as of Friday. More than half of that is for food, for our free and reduced students, for the Meals on Wheels we've supported, and also for the food deliveries to the people who would otherwise go to the food bank. So, and that's showing up in Fund 3 rather than the operating budget. So when you look at the financials, we're putting footnotes there so that you can see the total expense in addition, including the general fund and Fund 3. And just one note on our projections right now. At the last board meeting, I provided the board with an update on what we project to have available at year end. And we're looking at around $1.4 million. That's pretty much attributable to the fact that we haven't been in session. And of that, we're going to be meeting with the Board of Finance tonight. And we're going to ask to have a portion of that put in a non-lapsing account so that we can react to the needs that we will have to open school in the fall based on the guidelines from the state of Connecticut.
So if I heard you right, I think you said 1.4 million, let's call it under budget.
Correct.
And does that include the couple 100,000 you said for COVID, or is that separate?
Yeah, for right now, I mean, we're looking at guidelines, coming out for summer school, and we've done a lot of research in terms of how to meet those guidelines. There's all kinds of options. Some cost more than others. Some involved staff rather than things, but we can't really react until we have the guidelines published from the state of Connecticut, and that might not happen until after June 30th. So that's why we're going to be going for the non-lapsing account.
Joanne, Bill Perret. Joanne, the money from the state and from the CARES Act, just briefly, it sounded to me like that was really not education in the sense of educating children, but providing meals and things of that nature, which I'm not trying to qualify what you're getting it for. I'm just trying to understand what you're getting it for. It's when you said when someone hears the Board of Ed is getting reimbursed, it's almost like an extraordinary expense you're getting reimbursed for. Is that correct?
Right. So the meals are going to be coming from FEMA.
Yep.
So there's two different streams of funding coming in.
And that's
One is
something
FEMA.
you normally provide, though, right? Was that sort of like,
Yeah, it's going to be in the next fiscal year. So Lunda, we're going to have to work with the auditors to find out how we represent that on the financial statements, because we'll be getting, it won't be 100% reimbursement. My understanding, it's closer to 75%. The CARES Act is education related expenditures. So, if we have expenditures related to distance learning and we have to provide technology or materials or supplies to students, those are the kind of things that that particular grant would fund.
right? Thank you.
And that's a good point, Joanne. I had a conference call with Joe Centofanti, our auditor, to have that specific discussion is how do we handle these COVID funds that we're incurring now? Should we, some towns, some municipalities were setting up a separate, like a grant account where they're tracking them. We've been doing it out in the general fund. His recommendation was the way that we've been doing it is to keep the funds in the general fund on the town side as we have, And then if we should happen to get any reimbursements this year, or even if we apply, if there's guidelines are out enough time to start applying, even if we don't get the money, they could be booked as receivables with the actuals coming in that following year. But we haven't had any guidance, at least from the state yet. They just sent out the forms yet. Actually, this morning is when the forms came out with the guidance. But even with the state, you have to go through FEMA first before you can go through the state, and nobody has really started receiving FEMA funds yet. So it's unlikely that we'll see any revenues before June 30th. But those were his, but I do agree with you that we do need to stay in constant touch with them just to kind of understand we're not the only ones going through this, but what is their preferred practice as far as managing and booking these expenses. So with that, that's where we are year to date. What we're projecting on the general fund for the end of the year based on these expenses. On the COVID side, with 2 weeks left, there's still a couple of this is a tough one to project. As we moving staff into City Hall, there's some work that Tiger and his crew are doing to get the office spaces ready, and so there's some renovation work that's being done in the buildings. There's less of the PPE, emergency response types of expenses. I think we hit the peak of those at the very beginning, where we were spending a lot of staff time and overtime and procuring medical equipment just in response. And so right now it's more of getting the work facilities situated and ready to start taking in walk-ins into town hall and making sure that staff are safe from spreading the disease to one another. So right now, with about 2-3 weeks left in the year, we're estimating that on the town side, we may get to the 275 mark, but that just depends. I understand there's like a 40,000 item that's coming down related to just getting the workspaces ready in the various town buildings, but we'll know that by the end of, in about a week or two. And so overall, and here's where I said that we were using preliminary projections. Initially, we had projected that possibly the Board of Ed would come in at maybe 750 under, but from what I'm hearing from Joanne, they're coming in slightly higher than that. However, we are presenting to the Board of Finance this evening the creation of a non-lapsing account for the Board of Ed, and what that would do is we would basically transfer any unexpended funds from the general fund into this non-lapsing account. And we had this discussion as well with Joe, our auditor, on the best way to do it. There are a number of ways to do it. The way that he recommends is setting up a separate account, which is actually how the statute reads, is creating this non-lapsing fund. And so that's what we'll do. So of the 1.4 that Joanne said that the Board of Ed is going to come under, a portion of that, depending on how much is tabled at the Board of Finance and approved, will be transferred into the non-lapsing fund. So we won't see the full 1.4 savings in the general fund going to the fund balance. So for now, initially we had a figure of 75. So with that, was that?
Yeah, Linda or Joanne, just a quick question on that. So there's going to, as I understand it, if things work out the way you're asking, there'll be this, if I want to call it forever fund. That's what non-lapsing means. So it's like a $400,000 fund that will be used for, I guess the specific expenses for COVID that you're going to lay out tonight, and then that'll be tracked as time goes on, and eventually 400,000 theoretically will get paid. Is that kind of the way it works?
Yeah, I mean, if we need the entire 400,000, that would be the way it works. What we envision is that these funds would be available for July, August, and possibly September, so that we could react to the needs that we have to comply with guidelines and get the kids back to school. So it's set up for a specific purpose. You can't use it for anything else. And it's tracked on the town's books. We'll track it on our side as well and reconcile all the expenditures for audit.
Okay. And what happens if it doesn't all get used? Does that then come back?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
So that's the summary of the on the expense side. On the revenue side, there's a bit more going on here. As you know, when we budget for tax collections, we budget at the 98.5% collection rate, but our historic collection rate is usually in excess of 99%. And therefore, as far as the trend in tax collections, we're doing just that. When we started getting impacted by COVID, this was after the second distribution of taxes, and therefore tax collections in the current year were not impacted by COVID for the most part. And so those are projected to come in at 140 million. This is the number here that I'm highlighting in the blue column. Year to date, we're at 140.2. So we're projecting to come in at about $1.2 million in current year tax collections more than what we budget, which is consistent with previous years. We also budget for prior year tax collections. This year we had budgeted 350. So far, we've actually collected almost double that in prior year tax collections, and therefore we're anticipating over collecting in that regard by almost 370,000 from prior year taxes. Investment income is we're at a little over $1 million. We had budgeted 800, so we're projecting to come in slightly over in that regard. Our ECS cost sharing grant this year we had budgeted receiving from the state, not knowing, about 75% of the grant. We actually got the full allotment, and so that's why you see we budgeted 271. We actually received 369 year to date, so we're slightly ahead in those collections. And then we have all other revenue sources. These are miscellaneous revenues that we receive, and so those are 2.2, and so they're about where we would anticipate to get those. The other revenues that I highlighted at the bottom, these are the ones, and I sorted them by projection over budget. And therefore we start seeing a series of revenues that are coming in below our budget protection. And Tiger's on the call, he can speak on the tipping fees, but obviously tipping fees, we had budgeted 445. Year to date, we're at 320. We're actually projecting tipping fees to come in below what we anticipated collecting to the tune of 75,000. The excess cost grant, we had initially budgeted $1 million, which is typically what we do. There's some calculations that are done at the state level. We typically get pretty much close to that $1 million. So far, we've received 957. I don't believe there's anything else out there, Joanne. Maybe you can correct me. I know it comes, there's like 2 or 3 installments. From what I can see, this is everything for this year. But I may miss, there's usually a $30,000 one time, but I already saw that having posted. So I think this is 100% of what we're going to get.
This is 100%. You know, the state's going to come in, or our auditors will audit for the state. This relates mainly to the outplacement students because they're excess cost. We have continued to receive services, or the students have, from the outplacement facilities. So we don't expect, and we're paying the full amount. So we don't expect to see any change in this number, but there's buzz around the state that they're really looking at these numbers for the instances where kids have not received the services and districts have taken the credit, because this number was basically set at the end of February prior to the COVID situation. So,
okay. Thank you. Building permits, we started seeing this trend last year, even before COVID. And so you see that last year, I think last year we had a budget of also $1 million. We came in at 880, just slightly under that. This year, when we did the budget, we had revised it down to 900,000. But right now, year to date, we're at 574. I've had several discussions with Brian. He anticipates that we'll probably get to the 600,000 mark, which is about 300,000 below revenue for building permits. Conveyance fees is a similar story. Initially, at the beginning of the year, we were seeing and this is fees that we paid every time properties change hands. We had budgeted 1.2 million. Last year, we had brought in 1.1. So far, we're at 982. It's actually performing better than we had initially anticipated. Initially, when we started projecting, we were actually not anticipating getting over 900,000, but there has been a lot, especially once the weather got started to improve, transactions that have changed hands. And so right now we're projecting to possibly get close to $1 million. We may be slightly over that, but that is still below the 1.275 that we had budgeted. And then the big one here that we're is the parking permits, fees, and tickets. So this includes fees, tickets, but the biggest chunk of this $1.3 million revenue, the permits are about $650,000 of this amount. The permits are due in July. We typically send the bills out in May. And so we get some revenues in May, some revenues in June, and some revenues in July. So at the beginning of this year, we got about 130,000 of that 650 in July from the prior year, but we would typically anticipate getting about 450 to 500,000 in May and June. But because of COVID, we have not billed. There aren't a lot of people commuting to and from work, and so the town has made a decision to kind of wait and see before we bill out. So the May billings did not go out. As a result, that $500,000 revenue that we would anticipate getting in May and June, we will not see that this year. When we do send those bills out, we will see a portion of that revenue in the following year, but I don't believe that we would bill for the full 12 months. We will provide some relief to the commuters, and so it may be a bill that goes out that's maybe for 9 months or 10 months or some fraction of a full year, but we will see some revenue next year, but it will not make up for the entire year of lost revenue. So,
Yeah,
so that's
Linda's-
a big hit in this year.
Yeah, so if I want to make sure we got enough time to move on to 21 and a contingency work and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So bottom line is the the revenue projections weren't quite up to what a little bit less outside of the taxes, the categories at the bottom, but generally speaking, that's what, like 800,000 over the budget, right? Something like that.
Right. So
in total,
revenues are exceeding budgets, expenses are coming below, but not to the
and then
tune that we
the
typically
town
do.
expenses were.
Chuck, I'd like to ask
And
a
then-
question on the revenue. The last three items, I'll just make an observation. I assume the conveyance fees are down because property values are down opposed to the number of transactions. That may be an incorrect assumption. It's probably a percentage of the sales price. But more specifically, in terms of, parking permits, for example, one example, or the parking line, who makes the decision that we're not going to charge for parking for the full year or send the bills out? And who makes the decision that we're not going to charge for parking in town? I understand we're not charging for parking. I just want to make sure the decision-making process on both of those is at the right place in the town.
Bill, I can answer. It's the Board of Selectmen.
Board of Selectmen. Great, thank you.
And by the way, that percentage line, Linda, can't be correct. It's -1. It's not minus 1.95. It's something like 35 or 40%. Is that right?
You're right.
Yeah. Yep.
Bill, can I just ask a question on the process, if I may?
Yeah.
Can you, Linda, so projections at this point, it's really a projection for, I guess, 1 month because we have actuals to May, and then a projection, I guess, just for the month of June. But when you do these projections, do you have the budget broken down at the beginning of the year into 12 months, a budget for each of the 12 months? And therefore you can project just using the budget for the 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, or whatever for the remainder of the year. Or, as I think you heard you said when you referred, for instance, to building permits, and I'm talking revenue as well as expenses, do you actually reassess what the expense or the revenue might be for the remaining period, in this case, 1 month? So, because the budget was set a year ago. So if you could just sort of, in 1 minute, just walk me through the process of how you determine these projections.
Sure. Each line is different, and therefore, for example, the salaries, what we do each pay period, we look at the year-to-date actual salaries, actual positions. It takes into account vacancies, so the salaries are not it's not like the year divided by 12. It's actually based on the number of FTEs. On the revenues, like the one Joanne and I were discussing, those projections are based on grant awards, and therefore it's not divided by 12. We know that we've received award letters. This is how much we're going to get for the year, and so that's what we project from the very beginning if we know what that award is going to be. We have a number of expenses that we pay the bill at the beginning of the year, contract services and whatnot. So we factor those into account. So each line is projected differently based on the nature and characteristics of that revenue or expense, and then all of those projections are aggregated to this summary.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you, Linda.
Yeah. Rob, I think the answer to your question, and Linda, you can say yes or no, but I don't think that there's budgeting by month. Is that right, Linda?
For the most part. I mean, there's some items, like rents, those types of things. We know what the monthly rent is, but for the most part, we don't do the budget by month. Correct.
Right, but you have the year budget. But you don't have the year budget with 12 columns that show by month, right?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get.
At this point, that's.
I wondered because because the earlier schedules, we're not going to look at them a few pages before this, where we have actuals year to date, and we compare to the budget for the 12 months, and we say it's X percent of the budget for the 12 months. It doesn't really mean very much what without, when you get to month 11, but when you're sort of halfway through the year, it doesn't mean much. But let's move on.
No, yeah, it only means in relation to the prior year when you compare how are we doing this year relative to last year, but not relative to the current year.
That is meaningful, yeah. Sorry, I'm new to this, and many organizations, the private sector, you do. I'm not saying we should do this. Budgets month by month, so you have month 5, you've got the budget for 5 months, you've got last year for 5 months, you've got actuals for 5 months, but. Let's go on. You've answered my question. Thank you.
Does the Board of Ed budget by month?
So we use encumbrance accounting. We don't budget by month. We look at our salaries for the entire year, and we encumber them against the budgetary accounts. So we use a different method of basically tracking our budget. All of our procurement, for the most part, is encumbered through our purchasing policy. And just like Linda said, in the beginning of the year, we have a lot of contracts that come due for the full year, and they're encumbered and they're paid out. So unlike manufacturing or some other industries, which I'm familiar with, it just really the best model for the school district anyways is encumbrance accounting.
Okay. I just a quick question, Linda. So I know that there's been an effort by people, including yourself and Board of Finance and so on, to take a look closely at the expenses and particularly CapEx, I think, and see if things need to be spent or can be deferred until more certain times. Were there changes to a lot of this stuff as a result of that? And maybe the same kind of question when you do get to, the 21 budget and so on, the same kind of question with respect to expenses, but also CapEx. What kind of changes might have taken place as a result of those efforts.
Chuck, let me give Kevin one hand. There's a natural slowing down that's occurred because people are not really operating like normal.
Yeah.
Also, so there's been a natural slowdown in spending, but we're looking at it every month, every 2 weeks actually with the Board of Selectmen, and Todd Lavieri wants us to be looking as we come into the new fiscal year, what we can go slow on, especially CapEx.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so we can move on to 21 for your cash flow projections, and thinking about all that, especially over the next 4 months, I guess, are pretty key.
Sure. So I'm going to turn to the page with the cash flow, and this is information I presented to I believe it was the town council when we were having the discussion on the tax deferment. Let me find that page. So on page 25. So basically what we did here was at the beginning of the year was to just kind of see where we anticipate ending the year, and just looking at the first 6 months or so of the year to see where the cash flow would be. So we project in the general fund at the end of the year to end with about $29.5 million fund balance within the general fund. And so this is the number that will be reflected in the audited financials. And so this was prepared in the context of the 90-day tax deferral that the town council adopted, just to kind of see how would that impact the cash flow should this take place. There are a couple of assumptions that we made. I don't even want to call them assumptions, maybe they're guesses at the time. And so we're beginning to now find out how close or how far we were from the assumption. So basically, beginning the year with $29.5 million in fund balance, what the executive order as far as tax deferment said was funds that were mortgages that are paid in escrow were not eligible for deferment, and therefore those banks that are holding those funds in escrow would remit those to the towns on July 1, during the month of July, as they would. And so we looked at our taxes and their sources of revenue, and we saw that about 32% of the property taxes in New Canaan were escrowed. And so assuming that all of those are going to get remitted to the town in time without being late, we would have $22.6 million cash infusion to the town during the month of July. And so by August 3, we would have all of those remitted, which is consistent with history. So that's $22.6 million coming in.
Yeah.
We assumed.
Could I
Yes.
ask just a quick question? The
Sure.
banks were allowing, I guess it was up to the banks, but they allowed some deferral of mortgage payments to, and maybe some paying it on the end of the mortgage and stuff like that. To the extent that some of that happened, is that a potential shortfall on the escrow also, or was the escrow funded no matter whether that was deferred or not?
The decision is made at the bank level. For most mortgages, the escrow is collected ahead of time. You don't necessarily get the escrow back, but you could delay escrow for the following year. So we could potentially see some delays, possibly, maybe not with the August distribution, but possibly the December distribution. But we really don't know. It's a good question,
Yeah.
once that we've asked as well, but it's difficult to determine what each individual bank will do, and we really won't know until mid-July when we start seeing these revenues come through. But it is a possibility that it could be impacted.
Do they get paid like twice a year, just like everybody else from the bank?
Yes, the bank remits them twice a year.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Chuck, Andrew Brooks, I just want to quickly interject on this question as well. So I actually, after doing a little bit of research in it, because I think it's a good question to have, from what I've found, most banks are actually moving forward and making the payments, even if they haven't collected the funds through escrow from mortgage. payers, because ultimately, if they fail to pay the taxes on time, the town can issue a tax lien, and that tax lien would take priority over the mortgage lender's lien. And so obviously they don't want to risk their asset either. So in many instances, they're still moving forward with paying, in advance, even if they haven't collected the escrow, and then we'll just bill the mortgage holder for those funds down the road.
Okay, good. Thanks.
So I think there's a small risk on that.
Okay, but not much. Okay, thanks.
So we have about 67% of our taxpayers that are not escrowed. We just assuming that a quarter of that 25% don't defer and just make their payments as they typically would. That's 11.7. If another 73% or so take on the deferment, that would be $34 million that would be deferred. But if everything gets collected, even with a deferral by October, we would have the full amount collections. Now, the purpose of this was to show that even with the $29.5 million that we have in fund balance, plus the $22 million that we would collect from the escrow accounts, that would more than meet, at least on the general fund, the expenses. Because on the general fund, our burn rate is about $11.5 million a month. And therefore, that's what we would be drawing down on to meet those obligations. And therefore, just the fund balance alone carries you up to 2 months. If you bring in the escrow amounts, it'll take you possibly through December, assuming that none of these other revenue sources come in. So just from a cash flow perspective on the fund balance, assuming all of this holds true, of course, we feel fairly confident that we will be able to meet ongoing obligations, at least in the interim, in the first 6 months. And we'll see how all of this pans out during the month of July and August. The good thing about the way that the town funds flow is we do get some lead time. We will know in July and August what our actual inflows are, which will give us plenty of time to make adjustments moving forward, whether we want to go into the market and do some short-term borrowing to make up the difference. The state also has a microloan that they're also a microloan program from the CARES Act that local governments can tap into for gap financing should the need arise. I don't anticipate that arising for the town, but there are options out there to mitigate those potential risks that could be coming.
So, Linda, am I correct in saying that these were sort of recommendations that you made to the Board of Finance, and the Board of Finance accepted the recommendations? Because it is a set of assumptions. I mean, they're obviously yours and Kevin's, but I guess the Board of Finance signed off on these.
The Board of Finance reviewed them. We weren't really asking for a yes or no vote, but it was just to provide context to some of their decision making. But this was something that the town council viewed. I mean, their question was, okay, if we do this 90-day deferral, what's the impact going to be? It's a similar discussion to what we're having now. And so this was an attempt to kind of share what our cash flow is, what our seasonal inflows, seasonal outflows are, and where we anticipate being. But also saying that
you didn't have any pushback from others. I mean, this was, everyone sort of agreed, or they didn't disagree with your recommendation and Kevin's recommendations.
No, I think if anything, and Kevin, correct me, that they probably thought that we were a bit too conservative with these estimates. For example, assuming that only 25% of our taxpayers are not going to do the 90-day deferral. Many people thought that number was too low. We're probably going to have a significant higher number of taxpayers in New Canaan just pay their taxes and not take advantage of the deferral. We assumed 25%. They thought that number was significantly low. And Kevin, correct me.
Yeah. Also, Bill, we've had an advisory group that's been meeting weekly, and the landlords and the accountants on that committee think people are going to pay their taxes. So I think these numbers are crazily low, but we wanted to be conservative.
Good.
And that would be shifting some of the 34 up to add to the 11, right?
Correct.
Correct.
Yeah. No change in total.
Correct.
You know, you have to certify that you've been affected by COVID by 20% of your income. You know, $28 million of our taxes are paid by seniors over 65, and they, you know, they're on fixed incomes and Social Security. So there are very few people, even merchants downtown. Some of the merchants downtown may be able to claim it, but the taxes, the landlords expect to pay their taxes. So.
That's what I had for cash flow, Chuck. I don't know where else you'd like
Yeah,
us to go with
and
this.
you're looking at, you said about 11.5 per month expenditures. So then you kind of look at the 22 plus the 11, and that essentially covers your expenses, is what you're kind of saying, right? For the 3-month period.
Yes.
Is that, if I understand it right? So you feel you've got cash flow in during the third quarter, kind of enough to cover your expenses during the third quarter. And that's with these conservative assumptions. So that's kind of what you're saying.
Correct.
And then CapEx would be on top of that, is that right?
Well, the bonding is separate. It's not a cash flow issue.
Right.
Right, but I think the town funds it before you bond, right? So you'll have to kind of.
Not necessarily. There's funds in the bond reserve account. You know, the prior bond issuances. So we shouldn't really have any cash flow issue on bonded projects.
But if you, okay, when bonding anticipated to take place? Next year or this year?
I don't think.
We'll probably go out before December, Kevin, I believe, at least with the.
We ordinarily would go out with a $9 or $10 million issue. So in each fiscal year. But we did some new issue money in conjunction with the refundings, and I think we're in pretty good cash flow shape with bond projects.
Okay.
We could do the library, you know, as a one-shot deal if we because interest rates are so low.
Because it's a bigger. It seemed like several of the bigger, and I don't know, but the bigger CapEx expenditures in the $1-2 million range would be expended fairly early in the year. Is that safe to say, or no?
Well, certainly the road projects.
The road projects, the roof, the road, maybe the library, maybe the Waveney. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Waveney is not going to come up until July, but yeah, the East School roof and the roads are the two large items that will get underway during the summer.
Okay. Probably in advance of when the borrowings take place to fund that.
Yeah, but I think there's money already sitting there to be used from the prior.
Okay, and that's not in the 29?
No.
Oh, okay. So there's other money besides the 29?
Yeah, the money we raised in the bond market sit in a separate account.
Is that right, Andrew?
Yeah, so Chase is where our bond proceeds sit, and Webster Bank is where all of our operating cash sits. So I actually have a couple of emails with Linda. We're going to connect to look at the total cash picture.
So there's more cash.
It is higher than the 29.5.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds good, and then I understand you got things in place to track this, and it looks pretty, to me at least, it looks pretty well covered.
Actually, Chuck, to answer your question more specifically, the cash, the tax funded capital projects are in the general fund, but all the bonded projects have a separate accounting than from the general fund.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Chuck, anything else you want to cover in this section?
Bill, could I just ask
I
a
don't think
question?
so. I think from the.
Sure, please do. Go ahead.
I guess, Chuck, I mean, I don't know if we're going to spend more time on CapEx, but Chuck mentioned the East School roof. I guess it's a question for Brian or maybe for Kevin. I thought when we replaced roofs, we were going to put we're going to put solar panels on them, but I don't see that in the budget. Can someone answer that?
We don't buy those. They're a PPA. We signed a contract for 15 or 20 years to basically lease them. I mean, the investor owns the panels.
You're right. I'd forgotten that. So does East School roof not have panels at the moment? It will have through the contractor once this new roof is on?
Yes.
Thank you.
Maybe we could just take a quick look, Linda, at the CapEx, and then
Sure.
very, very quick, and just maybe just highlight 14, 18 million or whatever it is. And there's probably, to
Sure.
me, it looks like 4 or 5 major things that kind of make it up or make up a good percentage.
Right. So this is the fiscal year 21 capital projects list. The tax supported capital, as Kevin mentioned, these were approved as part of the operating budget. And so they total $2.2 million. And so these are part of that general fund budget. And so for how we fund these is we transfer $2.2 million from the general fund into the capital tax supported capital fund. And so the funds get expended out of there on a recurring basis. And so that's how we account for them in the general fund. We typically make this transfer at the beginning of the year, and then we're done with it, and the expenses occur in the separate fund. On the bonded,
We're not required, London, we're not required to fund that all up front, though. We could apportion that.
we could. On the bonded capital side, we have a total of $14.1 million in bonded capital, and so these are the items that the Board of Finance will be taking up this evening and possibly the Town Council next month. And those will get approved through the resolution. And the way that the resolutions are written is it's an approval for an authorization to bond, but it also is the approval for the authorization to spend. And so those resolutions do two things. And so these are going to be reviewed and taken up today, but the list right now is about a little over $14 million. And depending on what actions take place within the next month, we will know what this final list will look like. But these are the requests that have so far been presented for review.
Where is, Linda, you may not know this. I know I don't. Where is Collins Pond, or the bridge at Collins Pond?
Tiger's on the call. Tiger, is that one of, I'm trying to see.
That's in the out years. Right now we're
it's in the out years. Okay.
we're in the engineering phase. We had $250,000 slated, but that's also being paid through the state. The state's taking over the design for that. That's a new policy that they have, and then it'll be a 80-20 funding, but the construction is in the out years.
Where is Collins Pond?
Where is it in general?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's on Bonus Ridge.
Great answer. I wasn't smart enough to ask the question. You answered. Right. But that's good. But yeah, exactly.
Well, Collins Pond is the pond our house is on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know it.
Right.
I know. Good. So you're getting a bridge, Ed, huh? That's good. What do we do with the? I saw that there was some highway department equipment. What do we do with the old equipment that's replacing? What's the process for selling that?
We usually take it. We usually take a trade with the dealer that we're working with. So for a large truck or a lowboy or a pickup, depending upon the dealer, we take a trade for the existing equipment.
So the number that's on this schedule is the net number after the trade?
No, it's the purchase. Then we take the net off of it because we don't know at the time what we're going to get for the vehicle. Or
so this is the gross number, the cost of the new vehicle.
That's correct.
Yeah. So Linda, how do we do the accounting on that? How do we because I know we're going to be talking a little bit about purchasing, and I was just wondering, there's sort of two parts or three parts to purchasing. You purchase a new truck. How do we make sure we're getting the right value for the old truck? From an accounting standpoint, from a control standpoint. No, not that Tiger would do anything wrong, but just asking a philosophical question. I mean, it would apply to any department. And then if we don't have a good answer, maybe we should, think about building that into the policy a little bit.
I'm sure, but that's a good question. I mean, I think if I understand the question is if a dealer tells you, I'll give you $1,500 for a trade, how do we know that that's the right value? Is that the question, Bill?
Just from a policy standpoint, then, we can take that away. We don't need to answer that now, but,
sure.
Or if it's something, so if it's not traded with the dealer, but it's in fact sold in the aftermarket, how do we know the value? How do we know that it's an arm's length transaction?
But typically, we have our mechanics view it as well, and then we look on the blue book value of it. And then at times we've also given them out to auction, so to an auction house, and they've and then it's bid on the open market, so to speak, with people coming in. We've done it various different ways, but if we were trying to trade something in and they weren't going to give us the proper number, we wouldn't trade it with that individual or that dealer, based upon our mechanics review and based upon a view of what the Kelly Blue Book value is of that piece of equipment.
So I think from a policy standpoint, we should build something like that into our policy that, pretty much as you described, that we go in the public market. Joanne, what do we have some things like that in the Board of Ed? I mean, do we not?
Yeah, the few things that we do have on the Board of Ed is the SUVs that we purchase for our special ed transportation.
Right.
And we do trade them in with the dealer that we use for them. And we check it against the Blue Book. But when we're trading them in, they're pretty much towards the way or past the useful life of the vehicle. The other thing we have is technology, that we do our old technology, and we deal with a handful of different vendors. We put together our disposable stock at the end of the year, and then we get pricing from a number of different folks that come in and just deal with that. So those are the two areas that we use our bidding for.
And Linda, just has anybody either in the town or on various committees thought about, extending in the discussion, given the COVID environment and the difficulty with expenses? Have we talked about extending the useful life of capital expenditures? And has someone made a conscious decision not to do that or to do that? In other words, somebody, if you're out of a job, you're not going to buy a new car. So if your revenue's down a little bit, can we extend the useful life on some of these things?
Well, I know Kevin and I have had discussions with Todd on the Board of Finance on the timing of purchases. Whether does this need to be bought now? Can this item wait? The final decision, obviously, is the Board of Selectmen, and so they have been willing to provide some recommendations and suggestions. But that's part of the analysis in determining what can wait is looking at the useful life and those types of things. So that discussion is ongoing.
Bill, let me say this, with respect to public works vehicles, we tend to run them into the ground. Police cars, we tend to schedule because they just like the SUVs, I mean, they get a lot of miles on them and you have to turn them in. Ambulances, we automatically turn in after 3 years. What is it? But anyway, so that's been looked at, and but we perhaps can look further at extending somewhat the useful lives.
It's just an area of try to extend them. I remember it's always difficult to get the right useful life, and I don't think I've ever seen a new Canaan vehicle broken down somewhere.
John, what do you put on the Suburbans? 200,000 miles before you get rid of them?
Not close to that. Yeah, it depends on where the vehicles are going and how, but yeah, close to 200,000, and we've gotten anywhere from 1,500 to 4,500 on a trade-in. So it depends on the vehicle, but of course, they have to meet certain safety standards for them to be roadworthy through the DMV.
Yeah, there comes a point where we're paying more to keep them on the road and stay up to those standards than it is to, invest in a new one.
Yeah. No, I guess my comment wasn't about the SUVs as much as just in general, but just an area where we could save money. Just take a look at extending these to life. I mean, just actually, if you just took every piece of equipment we had in town and extended it 6 months, it'd probably be a lot of money. It's a one-time thing, right? But hopefully COVID is a one-time thing as well. But anyway, that's my point. Someone's looking at it and you're making good decisions. That's fine. Great. Okay. Anything else we should cover on the capital expenditures? Linda, you'll take a look at the policy standpoint in terms of trade-ins and, just making sure we put that into our collective policies.
Yes.
Good. Okay. I think the next item on the agenda, unless somebody wants to stay on contingency planning, is the review of the purchasing policy.
I think we talked about most of this. Any other actions from the state other than basically reimbursement of expenditure, qualified expenditures? Probably just that, right?
No, it's just that, and the state just opened up their portal this morning on with some instructions and guidance on reimbursement. But again, that's for the portion that's not reimbursed by FEMA.
Chuck, I think you're asking about grants. We expect to get all the grants that are scheduled.
Right. That's good. No, I didn't have anything else, Bill.
No, why don't we just go to the item 3, which is the purchasing policy?
Yeah, and the purchasing, this had been sent around to everybody, and I think there were some comments, and it's good. So I don't know if there's too much to talk about, but I think it's a good. My personal view, it's we got it, and it's good. So I don't know if there's any other. Maybe a little summary, Linda, of it, but that's all.
No, I have worked closely with Tiger and the department heads on this. It started off as a draft. We assembled purchasing policies from various communities in the state, outside of the state. We looked at them. We looked at our existing, because we already had guidelines in place. We looked at our existing guidelines. We sent the draft out to the user departments. They gave us their feedback. We brought those in. We incorporated their feedback. We discussed some of the issues that were brought up. It was then sent out to the Advisory Committee on Building and Infrastructure, which is where the bulk of the purchasing happens. They reviewed it. They gave us their feedback. We've shared it with the Board of Selectmen. And it was suggested that we also shared it with the Audit Committee. As you know, this is something that our auditors have recommended for quite some time, that we have a formalized policy that's approved by the Board of Selectmen. And they've had 2 reviews of it, and I believe they're gonna revisit this at their meeting next week and possibly vote on it. But they just wanted us to kind of send it out to as many people as possible just to take a look, and we've received a lot of input. So what you have here is a document that's been reviewed at least by 3 or 4 sets of groups before it got into this format.
When they have the auditors themselves looked at it, has Joe looked at it?
Yes, we did send a copy to Joe when it was sent out to the Audit Committee. Yes.
Yeah, make sure he gets whatever comment, make sure you get comments if you would. Great. Okay. Any other points on that? If not, I think then we're over to the review of the monthly financial reports and
Yeah, it's a good document, Bill. It's well written and very comprehensive. I thought it was good work.
Good, great, good. So why don't we, if it's okay, we'll move over to the, we'll let Joanne go first, and then Linda, how do you want to do it? Or you two want a team, whichever way you want to do it.
We've pretty much covered the financials. I think the format that you have that we haven't reviewed is comparing year to date with prior year to date. But I think the highlights are the same things that I covered earlier. We talked about the revenues. We've talked about the expenses. We've talked about where we anticipate being at the end of the year. Unless there's additional questions you have on the current year financials, I can go over those, but I believe we've covered everything.
Joanne, Joanne, you want to add anything?
No, I agree with Lunda. We've basically gone over everything. We do have the May's report ready. Our board just needs to review it on Monday night, and I'll get it out to the committee. But we are tracking close to that 1.4 right now. And we'll have more to report after the Board of Finance tonight.
Okay, good. Members, does anybody else have anything they want to ask on that? If not, we're on to item 5, which is AOB, any other business.
Yeah, I think the only thing here is maybe Lunda could just quickly talk about the status of the audit and what might be going on, and then I'm sure we'll talk more the next meeting we have, but maybe just a quick overview of what's going on.
Sure. And Joanne Noon is on the call, and I see Joe is on the call as well. We have started the preliminary process of the audit. They've begun with initial information request. We sent them some year-to-date numbers for the prior year. Obviously, this audit year will be slightly different given the social distancing and so forth, but we're so far on schedule as far as the request from them. As far as the timeline, maybe Joe, perhaps kind of share how you plan to approach this year moving forward. But we have started providing information to them, the funds, new accounts that we've created, and those types of things. I think Joe is on mute.
All right. Yeah, well, basically our process now for pretty much everyone has just been kind of the requesting the preliminary information, doing some of our transaction testing, and then at some point later this month, we'll be contacting Lunda and say, well, what's the town's protocol for us to come on site? There are certain things like we can't look at the books or the grand list. There's certain things we can't do. So there is testing that we do on site, or we can work with the town to do it a different way. So I was probably looking, later this month to start scheduling those type of things if the town's okay with us coming on site and as well as the Board of Ed. If not, then we'll provide an additional list of things that we would need to take a look at.
Linda, how much of the town is functioning, really from a books and records standpoint, a financial standpoint, people working at home? We hear this all the time with, businesses and actually school systems as well, but that's maybe more the education of the kids. But how much of the nuts and bolts of what's behind the scenes is working in an effective manner? Like if you go to the tax department, if you talk about the grand list, if you go to, and then my follow-up question would be for you and Joe, is there something we should be thinking, is there something we could do better in the next crisis we have, because there will be another crisis one day? Just as an observation.
From the finance operations, we were able to do a lot of our day-to-day transactions remotely because we're logging into the system. There were elements that required physically being here. The check printing, we would schedule those, but somebody had to be here to print and stuff and send out. But the reviews of reviews of documents, approvals, those were done by emails. Some of the challenges we had in working remotely was depending on the level of our finance staff, not everybody had the full capabilities to do their transactions at home. For example, we scan all of our invoices and bills into the system. A lot of that scanning was not able to be done at home because just not everybody had that capability and the bandwidth to do that type of work at home. And so on the finance side, we're all back now in the office, and so we're doing a lot of that now after the fact. But we have been able to push a lot of the back office operations. I know the town clerk has also, like we said, the mortgage registrations, those things were still happening. Some of those were happening remotely, but there's still a good number of transactions that still have to take place physically. And obviously, Public Works is an entirely different animal. But that's kind of where we are. Maybe, Joanne, you could speak to some of your processes, but I felt like coordinating between us and the Board of Ed, especially as processing finance payments, worked out not perfect, but I think we were fairly seamless in getting bills paid during the entire time that we were not physically in our various locations.
So prior to going out, we had planned that we probably would be going out. So about 3 to 4 weeks prior to that date, we started to test out remote processing transactions remotely from people's homes, and worked closely with Lund and Joanne. And, it really was pretty much seamless for us. We processed all our transactions remotely, with the exception of those things that we had to come into the office for, many of which Lunda has mentioned on his end, the scanning, just getting mail, and doing the things that you have to do. So it's kind of a hybrid for us, predominantly from home, but again, people coming in and out of the office on a schedule, so we weren't bumping into each other all that often. But it worked out pretty well from us from a back office point of view. The schools, same thing, coming in and out, the main offices, depending on the needs. So overall, it's going well. We're looking forward to coming back in full time. We're not quite there yet, but we will be shortly.
Yeah, good. So, for both of you, I'm sure you both have done it, but, maybe as we move forward over the next couple of years, the things we can add in the way of technology capabilities or others to,
Whoops.
What happened?
So we'll,
Looks like a dead battery. There he is.
there he is.
my phone rang, I'm sorry. That's number one. And then Joe, from an audit standpoint, given we've worked in a distributed environment, I assume part of the audit procedure will be to make sure that we didn't lose anything from a control standpoint, since we were, as everybody was, approving things in a different environment and having different levels of checks and balances than we might have already otherwise have had. I assume as part of your control assessment, if there was an area where we were actually weaker than we would have otherwise have been because we were working in a distributed environment, that you or someone will do some additional testing in those areas.
It's part of our planning process. When we sit down and meet with manager on planning, that would be a topic that we would ask about what was different and if there were any approvals that had to be different, or getting controls. A lot of it does happen in Munis electronically. So from
Right.
the expenditure side, but the concern might be more tax, some of the cash receipt areas, like what was different if nobody was in, or what.
Yeah. So maybe just two takeaways from my standpoint of the committee. When we get towards the end of the audit, if you come back specifically, you, Joanne, and Linda come back specifically and deal with the question, okay, what's different and what do we do to make sure the controls work? And then if both the Board of Ed and also the town, Joe, with your support, would come back and, over the years, we've talked a lot about Munis and who has access, who doesn't. We talked, what's on, what's not, and we talked about some systems that could be on. Would we have been better as a town and Board of Ed if we were more completely on Unis as if we were just more completely on it in every respect? And I'm not trying to say that we're not where we should be or that we're not in a good place, but I just think stepping back, and then having that as a plan. If there's some areas we can improve, maybe we should, think about that in the context of everything else we think about.
Linda, could you address for Bill the digital invoicing? Because the state of Connecticut has gone entirely to digital invoicing, and city of New Haven has, and Linda was looking at that, and Munis has the capability, but I'm a little frustrated we are not moving forward with that as fast as I'd like to see us.
We are not moving as fast as Kevin would like. But we did look at online invoicing, and we started with we approached. I think there was the first vendor we approached, but then we also came to find out that our vendor Munis has that capability. So we assembled a team together, finance people and department people, represented from the departments to review. So we had a demo. Through the process of that discovery, we also found out that this was a module that the Board of Ed has used. And so in our follow-up meeting, we invited, and thank you, Joanne, for allowing them to participate. We had representatives from the Board of Ed also with us on that call, just to give us their experiences, how the module works for them. And so they shared with us some elements at work. There were some elements that weren't quite turned on yet. And so the next phase in this review is we would like to visit, or at least have a discussion. This was pre-COVID. We were talking about physically visiting or having them come one of these communities. And I think we'd identified New Haven is one. And I think Joanne's on the call. Maybe you can remind me. There is I think it's Danbury, that is a town and school that are both using it. Their population and their volume is similar to us. And so that is the next step, is to kind of have a relationship with them and see what the use is. The issue is, obviously we like it, but I think the big issue is getting our vendors to tap into it. And that's the bang for the buck. And so many of our vendors, the small vendors that we use, this may not apply to them. They're small operations. It may require setups that they're not ready to have. But then you do have other bigger vendors that would benefit from this. But then the other issue we found out is on the Munis side, the Munis system has to be able to connect with that vendor's setup. And so they have a list of vendors that have already gone through this process, that are using it with other municipalities. Not all of our vendors are there. And so the question for us is, what's the incentive for our vendors to jump onto the system? Obviously, they're going to get paid quicker on our end, but the challenge is finding the efficiencies. I mean, if we have to do every single step that we're doing now, but we're only eliminating sending out the checks, are there appropriate checks and balances there for that to happen? But we did see the demo. It is a very good tool, Kevin, and we will follow up and hopefully get some more traction on this before the year is over.
Yeah, basically what it requires, Bill, is that people have to simply send their invoices electronically scanned into one common mailbox, and then the software analyzes the bill and either rejects it back to the vendor or sends it to the manager to approve. So it kind of eliminates the step of our scanning physically paper
Right.
invoices, which is kind of like archaic in terms of doing it these days.
Linda, one of my family members has a small business, and as much as he doesn't like to do electronic invoices, he works for a number of companies where if you don't do it, you just don't get the work, you don't get paid. And so he does it. I mean, now whether it's as simple as I've just stated it, but so I wouldn't be dissuaded by the fact that a lot of small vendors couldn't use it. I think if you just tell them they've got to use it, they can't work for the town of New Canaan. At least he, in his particular cases, has found a way of doing that. So, it's just the way the world's going, right? So, I mean, you
Right.
look at the positive way. You'll be helping them move forward if you can push that in. So I applaud you guys for looking at this. That's great. I think maybe at a future meeting, if we come back both on the audit question of controls, but also on this question here, because certainly that would help us in a covert type restricted environment as well. So if maybe we could just broaden that discussion out. With that, unless anybody on the phone has any other questions or any other areas they'd like to cover, I want to thank everybody for it, for being on the phone, and not our job. I mean, we're the audit committee, but we as citizens of town really do appreciate all the hard work and the environment that the collective team in New Canaan, town and Board of Education is doing on behalf of the citizens. So thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Thanks all. See you at our next meeting.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.